We are so excited to be opening up this beautiful space after seemingly many years of renovation and restoration and redesign. So good morning to all of you and welcome. I'm Darius Lakdawala, the Chief Scientific Officer of the Schaeffer Center, as Barry mentioned. Today, our event is the future of Medicare's coverage with evidence development policy. So at the Schaeffer Center for Health Policy and Economics at USC, we are very pleased to be partnering with two other institutions for this event. One is the Center for the Evaluation of Value and Risk in Health at Tufts University. So Peter, thanks very much for your partnership on this. And also the newly named Stanford Mussallem Center for Biodesign. And Josh, thank you very much for your partnership on this. And as I've mentioned to some of you, today is our inaugural event here in this beautiful space at the USC Capitol campus. The Capitol campus is home to our new USC Schaeffer Institute for Public Policy and Government Service, of which the Schaeffer Center is now a part. We also want to welcome all our guests who can't be with us in person, but we're joining virtually on Zoom. We are hoping and are working very hard to have a very smooth hybrid event. So please use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen if you experience any technical issues, and we'll try to get those taken care of as quickly as possible. Also, for those of you on Zoom, you can participate in the Q&A by submitting your questions using the Zoom Q&A function. Hopefully you're familiar with that process. And USC staff member will share the online questions with us here in the room so our panelists can respond. Today, we're going to dig into a policy that Medicare or CMS has used for more than 20 years to help ensure that Medicare beneficiaries get access to new technologies and ensure that we have the best possible evidence available to make the best use of those technologies. Coverage with evidence development has received a lot of attention over the past few years, and today we're going to explore whether or how it can be improved to accomplish its original goals. We're going to kick it off with an intimate interview with CMS's lead of the coverage and analysis group, Tamara Sirik-Jensen, who's responsible for implementing CED. We'll then have a few academics present our various findings on ongoing research into this area. And then we'll finish with a panel of stakeholders providing their reactions from their different points of view. Our goal today is to disseminate some of the most up-to-date analysis of this policy and to identify ways to improve this policy for patients. I mean, from the founding of the Schaeffer Center, our mission has been to improve policy through rigorous evidence of value and benefit, and this event is no exception. We encourage everyone, panelists, audience members, to participate with respect and constructive attitudes towards identifying solutions that can help improve our health system. So I'll now turn it over to Barry Leiden, our Director of Public Policy at USC Schaeffer, to start our program. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Hi, I'm Barry, and I'm going to be the facilitator of a couple of different discussions. The first one is most exciting. We've got Tamara Sirik-Jensen with CMS here. Tamara, would you mind joining me up here? We called it a fireside chat. You know, we've been trying to get a lot of permits here at USC for building out this building, and the fire department said no on that one. So sorry, Tamara, no fire.
Should I go one over?
This is okay. Are you all right?
I'm okay.
All right. Sounds good. All right. So thank you very much, Tamara, for joining us. I think it's just a testament to yours and CMS's leadership and interest in trying to make sure that the public is involved in this by participating here today. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And I think you've agreed to stay along for the whole event here. So feel free to chime in at any point if any of us say something that you think we could help you in what you're trying to do, improve that. So Tamara is the director of what we refer to as CAG, the Coverage and Analysis Group at CMS, and CAG is responsible for developing coverage decisions for Medicare at the national level. I think, do you also get involved in any way at the local decision-making process?
Yeah, so yes. So if anyone goes to the Medicare coverage database, I'm starting to do a deep dive analysis. There's over 90,000 documents on that, which we oversee. And so that includes around 350 national coverage determinations. I'm doing a full analysis on what that financial impact is. I'm surprised. I was a little shocked by how I did 3 and the number, I need to relook at it, but it's bigger than I anticipated. There's like 3 or 4,000 local coverage determinations on there, plus articles, 45,000 public comment. Like there's just so much. So long way of saying, yes, we actually write the national coverage determinations. We oversee local coverage determinations, but we have a clinical team that we can consult with our contractor medical directors who do a very, very nice job. As well as, if you remember, the same statute with some exceptions is used to make decisions on claim by claim adjudication as well. And our MACs, the last I checked, they process over 1 million claims a day. So it's all of that.
So a MAC is a Medicare administrator contractor?
Yeah, so it's Medicare administrative contractor. They do a lot of things, but they process claims is really, I think, what they're most well known for.
Okay. And then Tamara also has been in the coverage group for a while. How many years at CMS?
Well, we don't talk about that.
For a while.
For a long time. So I've been in the coverage and analysis group. The way I know this is because I was brought in after I just had my first kid, so 2004.
All right. Happy 20th birthday to your first son, your oldest son.
Daughter.
Sorry. I've got 3 boys, so.
Yeah,
Yeah. So, and then you also, if I understand it correctly, are responsible for representing CMS in the collaboration between CMS and your sister agency, FDA, on parallel review and other efforts to try to coordinate processes there. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So, yeah, we work closely with the FDA. And I will be honest, I don't remember the year, but I feel like it was 2005. So before, the way that the agency would work with our sister agency, FDA, is, we would say, hey, we want to do something on red shoes, just because they're here. And we would have to write a memorandum of understanding specific to that particular product, which doesn't sound very efficient. So we pulled together, the 2 agencies, pulled together a memorandum of understanding so that we could share information, more easily across the 2 agencies, and we didn't have to write up a very specific agreement for every single product. I mean, it really felt logical, and such a small step made such a big difference. So that was the way that we started to share information in that year. And then from that, we tried to change the paradigm or the culture that when you go to the FDA, think about who is going to pay for your particular product, because it wasn't happening. And so we need to change that thought process. Think about it while you're at the FDA. And then from there, we came up with parallel review, where we would look at the evidence at the same time that the FDA would look at it for their market authorization. There are a lot of challenges with that because we have 2 different statutory authorities. As all of you know, FDA has safe and effective. We have reasonable and necessary. FDA has very clear statutory timelines that CMS can't change, nor should we. And so it was very hard to keep up with every single product that came out of the FDA. Many of you have heard me. I have no idea how many FDA employees there are for device side of house. My staff is at 38. Not all of them work on national coverage determinations, maybe 10, 15. So that is a very small amount to be able to take all that information and work as quickly to go through that to issue parallel review. So the goal with parallel review was that we would issue a proposed national coverage determination or a proposed coverage determination on the same day or close to the day of market authorization. And we did that twice. The lessons learned, we learned from parallel review, and you can cut me off if I get too long. We did.
She got cut off automatically.
Thank you. I appreciate that. The lesson we learned from parallel review is many of the sponsors who applied for parallel review definitely, it really had to do, they didn't have a statutory category. That was the biggest challenge we had. So we might have had a lot of applicants, but they didn't fall within 1861 of the Social Security Act. So we didn't know what to do with them. And that now goes down a different path. And it can't get to, we can't even get to reasonable and necessary with that. So that was a huge challenge to try to work through all of that, in addition to the workload challenge of keeping up with the statutory criteria that the FDA had. And so, we came to the conclusion that the NCD process works. We do need to start to work more, earlier in the process, but maybe in parallel review can still work, but a lot of work has to be done up front. We then, as we learned all those lessons, created the Transitional Coverage of Emerging Technologies, TCET, to try to get, similar to what the FDA does, start those conversations. Where is your evidence base? Let's get around the table. We all know what it is now. Let's talk about it. And then let's decide collectively, are there any gaps there? And if there are gaps, how would we resolve it?
Sounds very logical, methodical. Backing up just for a second here, you are responsible for coverage generally. So there are national coverage decisions that CMS will make regularly on a product and not necessarily use coverage with evidence development. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so there's 350 NCDs, there's 26, the last I counted, coverage with evidence development, national coverage determination. So it's a very small part.
And CMS has, I think, if I understand it, but correct me if I'm wrong, pretty broad statutory authority to issue a national coverage decision on items and services if you want to. I mean, you have to have some rationale to it, right? But you have pretty broad authority to issue all sorts of different tools that you may have in your toolkit to, I don't want to say constrain access per se, but to limit the way that that CMS would pay under certain circumstances. Is that the right way of putting it?
I'm not sure. So the statute says, and I'm paraphrasing, so if you're reading it in front of you, it's not the exact words, but it basically says you can only cover items and services that are reasonable and necessary for the diagnosis and treatment. And there's a little bit more. So, and that applies not only to national coverage determinations, local coverage determinations, but for the most part, claim by claim adjudication. So we have, so the question I think you're asking is, how do you define RNN, reasonable and necessary?
Well, actually, when you just determine, you say, okay, you know what, this is a service that I think we should issue, not just cover all the time. We're going to come up with a policy on when we're going to cover and under what circumstances. And that's triggered perhaps by the reasonable and necessary standard, but you've got ways to, the policies on those coverage could be things like, we'll only cover it if it's done within the FDA label. We'll only do it if it's done in a certain center. You don't necessarily have to go through CED per se to have the power to have that kind of management, let's say, of coverage, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So FDA does a great job. They make a decision based on the evidence that they have reviewed for market authorization. And then we as a payer take it and decide, how does it work? Where should we cover it for the Medicare population? Where is the evidence there? Does it improve health outcomes? And we can do a lot of things, but in general, we say, here are the patients that it should be covered, that we see the evidence in that it's going to improve health outcomes. Here are the places of service that might need to be done: inpatient, outpatient, physician, wherever that might be. And then here, if needed, here are the clinical specialties that should do it. Or we may narrow it. It should only be a physician. Or no, it can be much broader than that. So that's the criteria we put in place to make a coverage determination. That's usually, and we always look to guidelines and to experts. So that is key as well. So that's how we would write a national coverage determination. We don't want, if we can avoid CED, I think you would, because if you don't have to do, if it's great and the evidence is there, then we shouldn't do coverage with evidence development. Coverage with evidence development is a policy vehicle so that it's showing that it's promising, but it doesn't meet the statutory authority of A1A. So you avoid a no. And that, I think, is key. You avoid saying no. And so you can now cover it in the construct of evaluating it a little bit more and finding out more information about it. Because in general, when the FDA is done, they're done. And it's not necessarily, not always, but it's not necessarily about the Medicare population. And that is key for us.
Okay, so a quick translation. A1A is reasonable and necessary.
Yeah, that's the statutory authority.
Okay.
That is key to my world, is the statutory authority.
Okay, so covers the evidence development. That's the title of this event. Let's get to what is it and what do you like about it? So, because you're very familiar with this policy. You've been living, breathing it for 20 years?
Long time.
Yeah.
Before it was even around.
Right. And so, kind of like you're talking to your grandmother, how would you describe covers with evidence development?
Oh, man. I have never described it to my grandma. My kids would be bored, but it's a really good question. Give me a second. So I think in a nutshell for me, it's you personally, I would like to get as much out to patients as we can get out there. We want that their team, their clinical team, their caregiver team, and themselves to be part of that conversation. And as we review things, we know that there isn't a lot of evidence or information out there that is answering some key questions about that particular item or service, whatever we're talking about. But we still think that it, based on what we know, maybe it's a younger population, maybe it's a population that doesn't represent Medicare at all. Remember, most of Medicare has more than 3 comorbidities, unlike the general population. Maybe it doesn't represent that, but there's a lot of things that are moving in the right direction. And so we want to get it out there. We want you and your physician or clinical team to make the decision on what is best for you. But at the same time, we want to collect some information to make sure it does what it has, what the manufacturer, the sponsor is saying that it's going to do. And so it's following all of that. And we want to do that with the least amount of burden possible. So we want to meet the manufacturer or the sponsor where they're at. So if we're not asking for RCTs. I've tried RCTs in the claim system, it doesn't work.
Randomized controlled trials.
Thank you. I have to go back to randomized controlled trials. That's not what we're talking about. We're really trying to do something that has the least amount of burden as possible. I think real world evidence might be able to do that because there shouldn't be a burden on the patient. So just trying different ways to get more information to answer those questions that maybe we don't have enough confidence in yet to get us to A1A. Or
Wait, you're talking to your grandmother?
I know.
A1A?
so that it meets the Medicare threshold for full coverage. And this will give us the information to get them there or to help you decide that perhaps it isn't doing what you think it is doing or whomever, and we make a different decision.
And what do you like best about CED? What's your favorite? Nerd out on us. Do you love the idea that you get to make sure that people have access to a therapy that might not otherwise be available? Do you like the data collection side of it? What's the part that you think is most valuable to it?
I like to be able, one, who likes to say no? I mean, yes is a much easier place to be. I mean, I'm sure there are exceptions to that, but yes is a much easier place. And this is a qualified yes. And so I do like that. But I think it's important. I think it's important that we take a really clear look at the evidence. We pull everybody in, the information we have in front of us, and really decide, okay, are there really important questions here that need to be answered? And are these important not only to the patient, which is key, but also to the team that's treating them so they can also give them the right information? So I really like uncovering that, trying to figure out that answer. And then, and then success is great. And then closing that down and moving on.
And so you've been working with this policy for a while. What's the downside to it, the difficult part of it? What would you like to improve on it?
Well, I mean, I wish it would go faster. So national coverage determinations the process is in statute. So we have to follow the statute. And for any statutory legal nerds, it's 1862L of the Social Security Act. But that is a process. And that process includes issuing the proposed, a minimum of a 30-day public comment period, and then issuing a final 60 days after you issue that proposed decision in the public comment period. That sounds like a long time, 9 months. It is fast to take in all that information and write it. I wish we could find a way to move that a little quicker. We're trying to do that by starting a lot earlier in the process, so we know what we're doing as soon as we get to day one. So hopefully that can move the proposed a little faster. And so I wish it would happen faster. I really wish my actual true wish, honestly, is I wish I had more resources to do more things. Because I think the issue is there's so many things in the parking lot. And if I could just take it all on at once, what I have in the parking lot, I think that would help too, because I need to get a lot of.
Describe some of these things in the parking lot. What would those things be?
Well, if you go to the Medicare coverage database or website, what you'll see is an NCD dashboard. And on that dashboard is a list of items and services that we've accepted, meaning they met the criteria to be a national coverage determination request, but we don't have enough resources to actually make the decision and go through the process. So they go on the list. I don't love that. It's not my favorite thing to do. And I think I just looked at the data. I think the first year we started to do that, and you can all correct me, so don't hold me to this one, is like 2018. So we were able to handle it until about then. So I don't love that. So we had ventilators for COPD on the wait list. Just open that up. We have, oh my gosh, I don't remember what's on the wait list. And I'm afraid, I know what's on the wait list and I know it's going to be opened in the next 30 days. So I'm afraid to say, because when I said ventilators, I'm like, is that one open? There's a couple more that will open before the end of the year. But I think there's 9 the last I checked that are on the wait list. There's a colorectal cancer screening test on the wait list. There's a hepatitis C screening on the wait list. I think HPV is on the wait list. Those are screening tests. We should be able to get to those. And so it's a lot of that.
Yeah, that's important. And I think we've heard a lot about the importance of making sure that there's enough resources for your agency to be able to do the work that you do. I think sometimes some stakeholders might think, "Wow, give the government more resources. That's more opportunity for shenanigans." But it sounds a little bit like what you're saying is those resources is to handle a backlog so that more technologies can get your attention, whether that's good attention or bad, but still at least it's not waiting in limbo.
Yeah, I think especially for screening prevention. So the only way that you're going to get a screening test or a prevention test for Medicare beneficiaries is through the national coverage determination process. It's the way the law was set up. It's different for prevention and screening, as everyone is probably here with your commercial payer. United States Preventive Task Force gives it a grade A or B, then you should have it without a copay from your commercial payer. The way the statute was set up was before that law was passed, because similar to the FDA problem, we in Medicare, the only way we could cover a prevention or screening test is if Congress passed a law saying pay for colorectal cancer screening. They then fixed that and did something similar to what I just said, which is Medicare, you can pay for prevention and screening, but it has to have a grade A or B from the United States Preventive Task Force, which is run by AHRQ, our sister agency in HHS. It has to be appropriate for Medicare beneficiaries, and it has to be reasonable and necessary. And it has to be done through a national coverage determination. So those things are all in the statute. So that means they have to come to us to have a decision, and then to also affect, I think, I'm not sure about this, but MA plans, Medicare Advantage plans as well. And so unless we make a decision, it's not covered for Medicare. And so that I find the ones that I mentioned, those are in general covered for Medicare. Like we're talking a small, we have NCDs on those, but that does bother me a little.
All right. Well, so we're going to open it up for questions here, both online and also here in the audience. So for those of you who are interested in asking the big dog here in terms of coverage and coverage as evidence development, here she is for you to ask those questions. You have received a lot of comments about CED, particularly as you issued your proposed guidance, your draft revisions, and then recently just published your final guidance on that. So you made some changes to CED guidance. Can you give us a couple of highlights of what you think were the biggest changes to the guidance?
So, well, one, we went through a lot to make sure that we got it right, and it can change in the future as well. So we asked our sister agency to issue a report on what should we change with the criteria that we last updated in 2016. So they did that with a public comment period. We then gave that report to our public expert committee, Medicare Evidence Development Advisory Committee, to then opine on it there as well. And that also had a public comment period, and that's how we got to the proposed coverage with evidence development that was published in June of 2023. The part of it that I never can say this right, but the part that I find, and maybe it's not a change, but the part that I think is very important, at least to me, is that we updated it. And I think it's in subpopulations, I can't remember, where your study needs to represent the Medicare population. And by that, I mean the Medicare population that's affected by the disease. So make sure you have those patients in your study, and also that it represents the Medicare population. So make sure you have the right amount of females, the right amount of males, the right amount of Black patients, the right amount of Asian patients, all of those things, all of those important concepts need to be part of your trial. Now, does it need to be the exact percentage? No. And we should have that conversation, but it needs to be well represented. And what has happened is many of the trials that we have reviewed in national coverage determinations, and even my guess is local coverage determination, it doesn't represent those populations. Their majority of them are white. They tend to be male. I think it is definitely changing, but it has a long ways to go. So I think it's that concept that we brought out, and I think, made this language stronger in coverage with evidence development. And we also have really taken a close look at that as well when we look at investigational device exemption trials, which is a collaboration or coordination with FDA, where you have a pre-market device. The trial gets approved by the FDA, you can have CMS help pay for those. So we take a look at those trials to make sure they do that as well. So I think, a lot of other, tweaks in there, but that I think is the most important one, at least to me.
So you bring up an important aspect. And as I was listening to you, I was a little bit worried that we're jumping into the weeds too quickly. So let me back out for just a second and clarify. When CMS decides to analyze a potential coverage decision under the CED context, it's triggered by this determination that it's not yet reasonable, necessary, but it's important enough that you want to try to support gathering additional evidence and provide some coverage for it while you're in that phase of additional additional evidence development. That evidence development piece of CED is it always a trial or a clinical trial? Because it sounded a little bit like the way you described it was like it's a clinical trial, which if I were new to this area, I would say, wait, don't you do a clinical trial to get FDA approval? Now we have to do another clinical trial for CMS? What's going on here? I mean, I guess in some ways you're saying, hey guys, you showed up with not enough evidence, and so we need more. And ideally you want that to be the highest grade evidence that you can have. But my understanding is it's not always like, RCT level clinical trial. And in some cases, my familiarity is with the transcatheter valve therapeutics, TVT registry. So it's a registry system, which is real world evidence data collection. I would argue that's not really a clinical trial. That's an observational study. But are most CED decisions, 26 that are out there, are they mostly clinical trial grade, or when you say trial, is it really a trial?
Yeah. So I try to use the word study intentionally versus trial, so people don't jump to randomized controlled trial, which is very hard to pay for in a very archaic claim system with sham and placebo and explanation of benefits that go to bennies, so you can't blind, those types of things. Although we've tried it, and so rarely, I think there's one that's a randomized controlled trial that we required. So, but most of them are what you've described. They're observational studies or your registries. They probably should have a comparator though, like compared to standard of care, to decide, is it better? Does it do, what are your endpoints? What are you comparing it to? And is it better, worse, the same? And so most of them, as I said, are clinical studies. The majority of the ones we have on the books tend to be data collection, as you have said. So whether that's a registry or another, most of them are registries. Actually, the majority of them are registries. But we've got a couple that have used claims data. And they take the claims and try to look at claims to demonstrate that, they take a look at claims, they analyze the claims to answer the questions we have in the national coverage determination. So we should back up. Anytime that we have a coverage with evidence development, national coverage determination, we put in the coverage determination, here are the questions we need answered before we will reconsider this to make a decision of a yes or no. And so whatever study a sponsor or manufacturer or other, we've had many people put studies together, academia, whomever, whatever study you put together, you need to be able to answer these usually 3 questions. And then we have some other criteria. And any study that you pull together to answer these 3 questions have to, at minimum, meet the coverage with evidence development minimal criteria for studies, which is what we were just talking about with the guidance document. It used to be A through M. As of August 7th, I think they changed it. I think it's now 1 through 18. I can't remember. I really wish they would have kept the alphabet. But anyway, it's 1 through 18. And so any study that you put together has to meet those 18 criteria. It sounds like a lot. It's not. It's minimal criteria. This is the minimal criteria that should be expected of any clinical study. If you do not meet these criteria, you should not be running a study. They're not like, it's really about scientific integrity. So that's in general how we look at it. And claims data can do that. We've had registries that can do that. We've had RCTs that could do it, observational studies, you name it, we'll look at it.
Okay, great. Well, it sounds like a pretty cool program. I think the goals seem laudable. Let's try to say yes instead of no. And if we can help provide coverage for the therapy or the item or service, I think is the technical words for it, let's try to do that in a way that's at least burdensome. Those are the goals.
That's the goal. That's the ultimate goal.
All right. So I think we're going to have some folks that may have some perspectives on whether or not those goals are being achieved and maybe some ideas on how to address those. But you get first word. What do you think? You think you're achieving those goals?
So I think, we've had this, we started this in 2003, 4, before CED, coverage with evidence development, was a true concept with PET for oncologic indications and then implantable cardio defibrillators. It was a long time ago. So I think there are a lot of lessons learned. I think it's an iterative process. I definitely think it's a better process than no. And I think it's helping patients and clinicians learn more about it. Do I think we can improve? Sure. I think we could, perfection is always your goal. Are you ever going to meet it? No. But we're going to get closer and closer and closer. And so we need to keep helping making these decisions, but learning and hearing from people and how we can make tweaks. I can make tweaks. Or even big changes. I mean, small changes usually lead to big changes, but it's continuing to try to get us so that we get closer and closer to the ideal. I think that TSET will get us closer. It's right now we're just in the beginning. It's going to be bumpy, and we're going to learn about.
Explain TSET for just a second, because you just introduced, and then maybe you mentioned it earlier.
I did,
but yeah, you did. That's right. Sorry.
I can.
Yeah.
So
transitional coverage for emerging technologies.
Right.
Right. And it's basically a way to go through a process to apply CED.
It doesn't have to be CED.
Oh, okay.
Because you're gonna, hopefully the goal is you're gonna be interacting a year before your FDA market authorized. We can talk about what that could be. Maybe you'll include all that information in your FDA trial, but if not, we can figure out what your evidence plan could be once you hit CMS. Or if you've already done all of it and all the questions are answered, then that's an easy NCD, then that's a yes. So that's the goal. I think ideally, maybe you never get to do CED. The answer is always yes, because you've already done what is needed to be done. I don't believe that every single product is applicable to Medicare patients, but maybe if you think it is, those questions are already answered before you get to the payer.
All right. So I'm not just like texting my bookie right now. I'm connecting with Vanna, who's in the back. She's monitoring the questions coming in from our Zoom participants. We have several, but I'm going to give preferential treatment for those of you who were able to make it. No disrespect to those who are joining us on Zoom. So does anybody have a question for Tamara that we'd like to kick it off with? Over here. And thank you very much, Stephanie. Make sure that our Zoomers can hear the question. If you could please identify yourself and your organization, that'd be great.
Sonia Dick with Monlika, a Swedish device company. So my question is, out of the 26 CEDs, how many of those were for screening and prevention?
There are no treating or prevention that are covered with evidence development.
Would that be something that could be done or considered?
It could be done and considered. We haven't done that. And you have, United States Preventive Task Force is a good group of experts, and they've reviewed it. So that would, we'd have to think about that carefully.
Hi, Dan Waldman with the Medical Device Manufacturers Association. Tim, I was just wondering, as you're thinking about the resources, you've got 9, I just checked, it's 9 things on the wait list right now. You have the new stuff that presumably will be coming in with TSET, given our upcoming October 31st deadline for the first nominations. And then you have the current CEDs that are in place. And there's been some focus on kind of the CEDs being retired. At what point do those get revisited? And obviously you are bound. The only way to change an NCD is through the NCD process again, and that takes resources. So how are you thinking about kind of the prioritization and the funnel that you're going to be facing? Since this is about CED, I would say specifically first with regard to the existing CEDs that are ready to be revisited.
Do you have any examples that are ready to be revisited?
I don't. So okay. That's this. Not advocating for anything specific.
Okay. It's a good question. So let me talk about prioritization, national coverage determination prioritization. Why do we do one first and another second and another put on the wait list? And right now, the way that we have it in a very old Federal Register Notice 2013, it's also on the coverage website, is we look at the impact on the Medicare beneficiaries. That is really what we look at. So if it's a national decision and it has a large impact, that should probably, I'm sure there's a lot of nuances there, but just in general, that should go first. Or maybe it's a large impact on a small disease. And so maybe that one should go first. So that's generally how we would prioritize. Now, with that being said, we should probably have more information out in the public on how we prioritize. So one of the things that's on my to-do list is to write publicly to get public comment on prioritization criteria. So it's been on our list for a while, and we hope, I don't have a timeline for that, but we hope to get that out into the public and how we would prioritize national coverage determinations, get public comment, and then finalize that so that everybody would know, what does that mean, large impact on the Medicare population or disease. So that is it's been a long-term goal. So hopefully we can get to that in the near future.
We got a lot of questions here coming in faster than I had anticipated. We have about 5 minutes. So I'm going to try to pick a couple here. To what extent are you able to consider patient preferences or patient experience data of clinical benefit, which may be different than what traditional medicine would identify as clinical benefit, as a part of coverage decision making?
I feel like you wrote this question.
I did not write this question. I
Right.
swear it's right.
So if I could just ask one favor of anybody, if someone could just give me a glass of water or whatever's on I think I might have one, I would really appreciate it. Apologies.
Thanks.
Yeah. So patient preference, can
Yeah.
we consider? Absolutely. The patient is the center of every decision we make. And so we should take that we do take that under consideration. And so that can take a variety of ways. You have patient reported outcomes, those data points and that information are taken under consideration when we make a coverage with evidence, you have me now, CED. When we make a national coverage determination or a local coverage determination, there's a lot of nuances in that question. And so we should, thank you so much. I ran up all those stairs at DuPont just because I wanted the exercise. I regret that now.
I did that this morning too.
They're like 100
It's
of
a good
them
workout.
for anyone that's not here. There are a lot of nuances in that question. And so if they have a particular product that they're thinking about, reach out so we can have that conversation on what it is we would look for on, patient preference and whether it's, data or anything along those lines.
Right. A question about the CMS data portal for drugs for Alzheimer's disease, bringing up actually maybe a different topic a little bit, which is you rarely have used CED on drugs. Most of the coverage decisions have been around devices. This Alzheimer's disease, I call it the Aduhelm decision. I'm not sure if that's the right way of referring to it. Brought up, I think, a lot of controversy over a number of different issues. But do you envision that more CED, TSET studies in the future may be done using similar methods like that data collection method that's considered, and maybe describe what that data collection method is like?
So you have a panel. I was hoping they would talk about that.
Sure they will.
Monoclonal antibodies is how we would refer to it versus a very specific drug. And it's a really good point. So national coverage determinations, just taking a step back, we tend not to do product specific or name brand specific national coverage determinations. We tend to do the family or the class of services. So for that one, it's monoclonal antibodies. So the question was about the registry of how we did it?
Yeah. Are you thinking about doing that again?
I don't know. It's a good question. So what Barry is talking about is we issued a decision, and I think it was 2 years ago. I can't remember. But it was a coverage with evidence development decision for this class of drugs to treat Alzheimer's. It's to reduce beta amyloid in the brain and treat, that was what the drug would do. And so, but there were a lot of questions about that particular drug. Specific, we had a lot of questions. The experts had a lot of questions. But it showed that there could be promise with that. And so we didn't believe no was the right answer. Let's figure out, let's cover it and get more information about it to figure out what it does, what it doesn't do. And so we did our process. We issued a coverage with evidence development decision with the 4 questions that we wanted answered with the criteria that every trial or study should follow. We didn't get a lot of takers on that. And we didn't believe that patients should have no coverage. So we took it on ourselves and we pulled it together. And we put together a registry. And the registry takes clinicians less than like 5 minutes to complete. I just reached out to a bunch of physicians that are treating these patients to figure out, okay, what's going on? Where are the problems? Is it the registry? Those types of things. And so I think that part of it is working out very, very well. And then now the next step is the protocol and gathering all that data, not only from the registry, but linking it to claims and perhaps outside data as it's available to be able to answer those questions. So we hope to do that over the next, it's not going to take us months. So over the next few years.
Great. Well, we're about at time, but you've agreed to stay here for the rest of the session today, and maybe we'll figure out a way to weave in some of these questions and then throw a microphone to you in the audience if you're the best person to answer them. I'm sure there'll be others that have points of view on some of these topics. But before we let you go, first of all, I want to say thank you very much for everything that you do. I think all of my friends in this field all agree that you're one of the best public servants that we've ever had an opportunity to deal with. A real, true, just genuine person and straight shooter. So thank you for doing that. I really appreciate it, for being who you are. We do have a QR code that we like to put up on the screen. I don't know, Vanna, if you can do that. So CMS, like many of its sister agencies, does a great job of putting together a lot of different resources that could be useful to you to learn more, find out more. You mentioned, there's a list, the database of all the coverage decisions that CMS has, et cetera. And so in the past, what we've seen is that this is usually a PowerPoint slide with a lot of long URL codes. So we decided we try to make it a little easier for everybody. So if you want to use your phones that you're in here, even if you're online and you're sitting in front of your computer, you can use the QR code there to get access to literally the PowerPoint slide that Tamara has used when she's on the road on these things, and each of the links are live, so that way you can go directly to the resource. And this is being taped, and so for those of you who don't get a chance to do it, you can go back to our website later and fast forward to this spot and get access to it. I think we might actually also be posting slides from the presenters, and this one will be included too. Yeah. So thank you very much.
The first link on there is the Medicare coverage database. So if anyone wants it, and it'll lead you to many, many other things. May I say one last thing?
Please.
If you're interested in coverage, coding, or payment from the Medicare program, if you use this code, there is a link in there for the Medicare new tech, or I think it's the Ombudsman for Drugs and Devices. I highly recommend clicking on that so that you can get a meeting with CMS with not only the coverage group, the coding group, and the payment group. All three of those groups are important. I'm just one of three, and one. You need two others. And so I think that was one of the things the agency really did well over the last few years, is pulling that together so that you can meet with all of them. You may not get the answers during that meeting, but we're aware of your product and we're talking about it behind the scenes.
Great. Well, thank you again so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is my colleague, Darius Lakdawala, who will be presenting. We've got actually a panel of presenters. Each one of them is going to spend no more than 10 minutes walking through some of their research. And what we'd like you to do while they're doing that is pretend like almost like you're in class. This is a university, and write down some questions for the experts here. These experts / instructors are deep into the topic from both a data analysis perspective, but also from a policy perspective. And Darius is going to kick it off. He's then going to be followed by Dr. Makauer with, I think if that's the order. Is that the right order?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So it's going to be Darius Lakdawala, Josh Makauer, and Peter Newman from Tufts.
I'm going to say a little bit about work that we've been doing on CED. that I'll share with you, and also both work that we've completed and work that's ongoing. Apologies for my voice, which is less mellifluous than usual, if you can believe it. So we published a study, and by we, including some of the people in this room, Barry and Peter, and a number of other experts. And our goal was to understand what has CED already accomplished and how could it be made even better. In order to perform the study, we relied on a literature review. We convened a set of experts, and we conducted structured interviews with key policymakers. So I'm going to share with you some of the high-level findings of this study, as well as some follow-on research that we've been doing at USC in the wake of what we found. So as Barry and Tamara mentioned, CED has a number of important goals, which are indeed very important, valuable, and laudable goals. And one way of thinking about this is there's a goal of expediting earlier patient access to new therapies. So instead of saying no, let's figure out some way to say yes under the circumstances. And another goal is that's consistent with that is to generate evidence supporting a determination that a therapy or an item or service, I guess, is reasonable and necessary. And in both these cases, the answer to the question that we reached was that CED is meeting its goals with some room for improvement. So in terms of expediting early patient access, indeed, there are important cases where CED is affording access to therapies that may not otherwise have been covered. On the other hand, there are cases that we've been looking at where CED limits access of some clinically eligible patients in need, and sometimes in ways that exacerbate the disparities that we're all focused on addressing. The second goal is qualitatively similar in terms of its achievement, that yes, CED is in fact generating a substantial amount of evidence. A significant quantity of evidence is being generated to support the reasonable and necessary determination. On the other hand, the persistence of requirements, meaning that it's very difficult, empirically, there aren't a lot of cases where the requirements have been lifted and a determination of reasonable and necessary has finally been reached, suggesting that there's some like lingering, almost indefinite incompleteness in the evidence that's being generated, which is potentially a problem that we can think about how to address. So we identified 4 challenges for implementation. Some of them are just plain hard. One of them, which is very hard, is what are the criteria for requiring a CED, and how do we provide real transparent clarity around those criteria? If you had 10 experts in a room and asked them what reasonable and necessary means, you'll get 26 different opinions. So this is not an easy problem to solve, but clarity around what this means, particularly in the context of taking economic criteria off the table, becomes both important and difficult. I'll have some more to say about this later. A second point is that there are some cases in which evidence generation has created its own sorts of disparities. And so there's been a failure to improve access in some of those cases. And in particular, we looked at the role of centers of excellence in unintentionally creating inequality of access. So just a little bit of background. In some cases, evidence development requires that a registry or a trial, I guess maybe we should now call it a study, needs to be run through an eligible hospital or center, which is often referred to as a center of excellence. The question we were interested in was, what is the patient population that has access to centers of excellence, and how does it differ from the generalized patient population across the country? So specifically, we were looking at whether patients treated with products or services at these CED qualified hospitals reflect the overall population of patients. So if you look at the approved registries and approved trials associated with CED decisions, and the hospitals that are eligible to participate in them, what are the discharge statistics of those hospitals tell us about their population versus the broader US population? The results were kind of interesting. One finding of this is that there's a significant exacerbation of access problems for rural populations. Now, rural populations already have more limited access to care, but this doesn't include that because this is comparing comparing the fraction of rural patients discharged from CED eligible hospitals with the fraction of rural patients discharged from other hospitals. So this doesn't even include the fact that some rural people have less access to hospitals in general. But it shows you that the fraction of rural patients in CED hospitals would be significantly different in terms of access to care. I think that's actually flipped. So there's about a 50% reduction in rural population discharges among hospitals that are eligible for participation in CED. Similarly, if you look at the area deprivation index, which is a measure of socioeconomic status of areas, what you find is that for trial eligible hospitals, there's a significantly fewer socioeconomically disadvantaged patients getting discharged from trial eligible hospitals compared to others. There's less of a difference in the LIS enrollment access, so that disparity seems not to be as significant a contributor. There are also significant burdens on providers and patients because these are often complicated evidence generation activities. So an example, Barry mentioned this, is the TVT registry for transcatheter valves. It has over 276 fields. It takes about 4 hours to answer. As a rule of thumb, as an investigator, when we field surveys to patients, if the time that the respondent takes to fill out the survey is more than about 15 or 20 minutes, we start to get a ton of attrition from the survey, suggesting that that's kind of a threshold level for acceptable burden, and that for a scientist, which is a little different than in this setting, but still an interesting benchmark. So efforts can be made potentially to reduce that data collection burden. There is, in addition, a burden related to the centers of excellence model. The travel to those centers of excellence impose additional burden on patients, particularly those in rural areas. And here's an example of the TVT registry data collection instrument, which is scrolling helpfully for us on the left-hand side of the screen. It's long. And we know from our experience of survey with a completion and administration, potentially a data quality issue as well as a burden issue, because people filling out surveys after this much time tend to lose interest. And so for one reason we don't like to give surveys more than 15 or 20 minutes is that you find that validity goes down if the survey length increases too much. The last implementation challenge we identified was there's kind of an unclear process for reconsidering or ending CED requirements. That the timeline or guidance for what constitutes sufficient evidence is not always obvious. So this led to 4 recommendations that we offered in our work. One is a strategy for adopting clearer criteria for the application of CED. It's to define this tricky concept of reasonable and necessary that is decoupled from economic considerations. It's to provide clear criteria, which we think mean that evidence requirements have to address specific questions about the benefits or risks that patients care about. So that's the first set of clarity objectives. The second is to develop a process for more efficient implementation. And we think patient organizations can play a role here in identifying what is burdensome, what's acceptable, what can be achieved. So measuring burden and attempting to mitigate it to the extent possible, and that which of course means you still have to collect evidence of some burden is inevitable. But understanding where that burden lies and how we can minimize it is an important step here. A third issue is to create a transparent framework for coverage constraints that do get implemented, that those constraints, it would be helpful to link them very explicitly to evidence on clinical value. Like why do the coverage constraints exist? What's the reasoning? And in what ways does it connect to our understanding of the patients that benefit or fail to benefit from the therapy in question? And finally, thinking about what the reconsideration process should look like. Fixed timelines would be helpful, and processes that are very clear from the outset would be helpful to set expectations. So in conclusion, CED already has a lot of potential to improve access and also generate evidence of value, which we are all here to celebrate in some sense, and also improve incentives for innovation, because without evidence of benefit, risk, and value, you can't get good innovation incentives. And if we address those challenges, we'll have a more effective, an even more effective CED program, and also a more equitable system for patients. So thanks very much, and I'll hand it over now to Barry.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Darius. Appreciate it. Now we're going to have Dr. Josh Mackauer, who is the co-founder and current director of the Stanford Mussallem Center for Biodesign, recently renamed. He established that center back in 2001 with Dr. Paul Yock, and he holds a number of positions. We were just chatting. He said, please don't read all of that, so I won't. But I will say that he's a prolific inventor and entrepreneur, holding over 300 patents and patent applications, and has founded numerous successful medical device companies through his incubator, Exploramed. So knows a little bit about innovation and how to get products to market. So please, Dr. Mackauer.
Thank you very much. And I've got a lot of information to cover, so I'm going to move quickly, but hopefully these slides will be available for everyone. I was asked to sort of paint the broader picture of the why. Why are we here talking about coverage with evidence development? So I'm going to start a little broad, then we'll get a little bit more specific. Firstly, what is biodesign? Our mission is really to improve outcomes and equity through three means: innovation education, innovation translation, and innovation policy. And so today we're talking about policy, and primarily our connection is to this vast universe of innovators and those in the innovation ecosystem. So many of the opinions and perspectives that I'm sharing are not necessarily my own, but they're the perspective of that community. Interestingly, in a conversation I just had with Tamara last week, I created this slide because clearly coverage is only one element. There are so many other challenges facing innovators. And I think it's just important to point this out, that while we're focused in on coverage, there's just a myriad of challenges to get from an FDA authorization all the way to patient access. And this is what innovators who are working with novel technologies, mostly on the startup side, have to navigate to be able to accomplish that successfully. And it's quite daunting. So that is the reason why in our studies we've shown that reimbursement is the primary thing gating access, and it's also on the first mind of inventors and innovators as they consider new technologies to bring to patients. But now, why CMS? Why focus on coverage? Why CMS? And the reason is because CMS is the largest payer in the world. They lead the way globally and in the US. So when CMS decides to do something, that actually has a profound impact on other payers, and so it's also an agency that is in the service of the public. And so that opportunity for engagement, comment, et cetera, which we have today, which we treasure so much and appreciate the conversation with and the dialogue, that's the opportunity that we have today. Now, historically, I will just say when I'm using coverage with evidence development, I'm also really referring to the broader idea of being paid for a service or product in advance of, let's say, a final and permanent decision. So I want to broaden it out more than just the specific programs. But as we talk to the specific programs, these have basically been underutilized for a variety of reasons. Of course, there's a substantial backlog, as we heard. We also heard that FDA and CMS have different requirements. And so sometimes if you'd like to do a parallel view, it's very difficult because FDA is asking one thing and there's other things that CMS needs, and they really can't be accomplished in the same thing. But I do want to raise one important issue that has limited interest and engagement from the startup community in these programs, is that they're intimately linked with an NCD. And that might seem a surprise. Well, isn't that a good thing? Well, the challenge is that with the unclear specificity of what reasonable and necessary is, one is at risk of a non-coverage decision. And that is a death knell for your technology. So if you are a small startup CEO and you are considering this, you without a clear framework on what crosses the threshold, that is a very risky proposition, and that's why it's been underutilized. So one other aspect of the why is to understand, what does it look like when you aren't in one of these programs? How long does it take to coverage? And so, I won't cover the historical basis of MCIT, et cetera, but what I'll just say is that we endeavored to study what is the timeline for a breakthrough-like technology from FDA authorization all the way through to nominal coverage. And what you can see here is the number of technologies that we studied over this time frame, over a 4-year time frame. We followed them forward and to present day, and I'll even give an update that we haven't published yet, but I'll share the data with you on the technologies and where they went. Interestingly, 77% of technologies that met that criteria did not need a special pathway or new coverage. So most of these are within existing frameworks that are already covered. That's an important point for those that might be concerned that some of these programs would bankrupt CMS. In fact, there's a small number of technologies that are novel, and so novel that they don't have an existing coverage pathway. This is what nominal coverage looks like. I think for many CEOs who are leading companies, they'd say that's not even coverage. 3 of 7 max or et cetera is a small threshold. Obviously, an NCD is certainly an important, powerful threshold. But this is what we defined as the baseline to say, okay, check the box on coverage. And when you look at this chart, what you'll see is on the left-hand side is where these technologies received authorization from 2016 to 2019, and then where the red dot appears is where they crossed the threshold on nominal coverage. Most important impressive thing on this chart is the variability and how many were still not covered as you move all the way out to 2023, and a range of a coverage that is quite long. Now, interestingly, back to that chart, in the study that we ran, over 50% of these technologies were still not covered on the other side of that timeline. And when you do the statistical analysis of that data, it predicts that the average time from authorization to coverage is about 5.7 years. And that is way long. Many of these technologies have been studied for at least 5 to 7 years already. And it's important to note that the venture model is about a 10-year model. So the longer this gets, the less likely venture investors are willing to undergo the tremendous risks to invest in a technology that could be transformative for patients. And that is a huge concern for all of us. And that's why what we're talking about here matters. I just want to mention that there is a new pathway that is being considered by Congress that is called out in this bill, HR 1691, that creates a new pathway with even more certainty than TSET, which we just discussed in the previous discussion. that provides 4 years of coverage and for a broader set of breakthrough technologies. There are some exclusions. And most importantly, this also provides very well needed resources to CMS to allow them to employ more people, to be able to get more throughput, and to be able to evaluate more applications. So that's a really positive thing about this bill, which we're hopeful will get a vote in the coming session after the election. So I'll just summarize here in conclusion that reimbursement is a three-legged stool. It's coding, coverage, and payment. Coverage is only one piece of this very substantial challenge that innovators have to navigate, but they all need to be revised and revisited to be able to accelerate access for patients for important technologies. And I think that the startup and innovator community is very interested and excited about working with policymakers to figure out a way to make this work better and less expensively so that we can get better patient outcomes in the long run, and that we can have a thriving innovation ecosystem that supports these innovations. So hopefully we'll see a vote on 1691. It'll move forward into a law, and that will provide these resources that we need at CMS. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Next up, Dr. Peter Newman, who's the director of the Center for Evaluation and Value and Risk at Tufts Medical Center and is a professor of medicine there. He co-founded CEVR in 2006, and he's renowned for his work in health economics and policy, including founding the Cost Effectiveness Registry, a comprehensive database of cost effectiveness analyses in healthcare. So, Dr. Newman, take it away.
Thank you so much, Barry, and thanks for your leadership in the field, and thanks to Darius and Josh. So my colleague, Sean Tunis, who many of you know, and I received a grant from Arnold Ventures, grateful to them, to ask this question: does CED need an extreme makeover? So we're looking at CED and thinking broadly about the policy. And I want to start with a piece written 2 years ago by a journalist, Matt Herper at STAT. And he wrote a piece entitled, "Here's Why We're Not Prepared for the Next Wave of Biotech Innovation." And he makes the point that we have a lot of wonderful advances: cell and gene therapies, mRNA platforms, CRISPR technology, devices. It's biology's century, he says. But he then argues that we're not developing the infrastructure we need to know what works and how well. And he has this quote that I like: "We try to solve problems by building faster and more expensive Ferraris when what we really need are better roads." So no metaphor is perfect, but I want to stay with this one for a moment and apply it to coverage with evidence development. Okay, so we have our Ferraris. These are our medical devices, and some of the companies are here. We love our Ferraris. This is best done in the private sector. Private sector has strong incentives to respond to consumer tastes and preferences and to innovate. We don't want our government to build Ferraris. Probably wouldn't maybe be happy with what we got. Then we have our roads. Now, this is our data infrastructure, our data systems, our processes, not just CED, nationally. And the roads are public goods. That's the point I want to make. Public goods, they benefit everybody, they can be used by everybody, and it's something that the public sector needs to invest in. And again, no metaphor is perfect, but the idea is we need to invest, of course, in the Ferraris and the private sector. We love that. But we need to invest more in our roads, not just for CED, but to connect CED to larger data collection processes and evidence generation strategies. And full disclosure, as I talk about Ferraris, I drive a 2020 Subaru Outback, and my wife drives a 2011 Honda Odyssey. Darius and Josh, you probably drive something closer to a Ferrari, I'm guessing. And Barry, with those shoes, I can only imagine what you're driving. So my colleagues and I have been writing a lot about these issues over the years. Our latest piece is in STAT First Opinion a few weeks ago. Medicare's new transitional coverage of evidence of emerging technologies program doesn't go far enough. So we elaborate on some of these themes that I've been talking about and basically make the following points. And some of these have been talked about already. First, the CED program has a mixed record. You've heard that from Darius and even Tamara. Conceptually very appealing, provide early access, promising technologies, investigate evidence gaps. It sounds great. We've had some successes. Another point I want to make that maybe hasn't been made, not only have we probably had some successes, but we've learned a lot in the process. Joe Ross and his group at Yale have been documenting the published studies that have come out of CED. And, the clinical community has benefited from those. On the other hand, and Darius went through the points, data collection is often prolonged and costly. Only a handful of technologies have converted to full coverage or been restricted or withdrawn. They haven't always yielded useful evidence. There's not always a good coordination with FDA. We make the point in the piece, CED debuted in a period of BlackBerries and DVDs. A lot's happened over the years and in terms of analytics, data collection processes, and so forth. So it's time for an overhaul. That's the point we make. TSET, in our view, takes important steps in the right direction. The early engagement with the companies prior to FDA authorization or clearance, clearer defined, shorter timelines, the evidence development plan, encouraging fit-for-purpose studies. You've heard about this, more efficient evidence generation. But we also argue that TSET is limited. It's built on the existing NCD chassis. And so it can only be deployed through the NCDs, and it has strengths, but it also has some limitations. Also, I'm not sure this has been a point been made, there's only a few approved breakthrough devices a year. Doesn't really get to diagnostics, probably won't get to diagnostics, certainly won't get to drugs, and we can argue about whether that's a good idea or not, but it's omitting large amounts of technology as well as large numbers of devices that CMS already pays for through bundled payments and existing systems or local coverage decisions. And there's little evidence for device companies, relatively little evidence for those device companies to collect data in those circumstances, which cover the vast amount of technologies. The other point we make is that TSETs tend to be one-offs. They're not connected to other data collection efforts. And this is not unique to Medicare. We have a fragmented national system. So we argue that Medicare should broaden TSET in its scope and ambitions. For that, it certainly would need more resources for the CAG and ideally for data collection infrastructure as well. So we talked a little bit about that, and Josh just mentioned the work that's going on in Congress. $10 million is certainly good, and it would give resources for the CAG, and you talked about what's in the parking lot and other things. But for this extreme makeover, we argue you probably need order of magnitude more than that. And if you compare anything that CMS is doing in coverage to what FDA does in its approval, obviously there's a lot of differences. It's a pretty small amount. Okay. Before I get to that final point, statutory authority. So Tamara touched on this. We have 1861A1C, 18A and E. So whether and how CMS has actual authority to do CED is debated. They certainly have used this authority in a workaround, but it's not clear that the authority is there. Certainly it would be important to strengthen it, is what we argue, especially in some of the recent Supreme Court decisions. It would be great if CMS had that authority. The other points we make is FDA has explicit authority for accelerated approval for drugs that meet unmet need and no alternatives. CMS doesn't have equivalent authority, and it would be good for CMS to have that as well. And this is maybe is controversial, tying payment to evidence generation milestones. We can talk about that. But we do make this final point, a truly extreme makeover for CED would leverage the program in support of a national evidence generation ecosystem. And the analogy we use is the interstate highway system. Think about the connection of roads across the country, not just narrowly in one region or state or locality, we need an interstate highway system for evidence generation. It would transcend CED, but CED could be an important component of that. So with that, I will thank you very much.
So I'm going to kick it off with what Peter ended with, and kind of get Josh and Darius's reflections on this idea of maybe taking I'm going to call it the hammer, the power of a coverage contingency. In other words, you don't get coverage unless you collect data somehow. How the data is collected and when that coverage hammer happens is a question. But let's just say that general idea of using the power of federal agreement to give the benefit to the beneficiary as a condition in exchange for data collection. Is that a good idea? Is that a good use of let's say the infrastructure of the road there? And I will make a point. You did pick a couple of interesting photographs that Ferrari was pristine. That road, not so much. Is that a comment on the federal government's infrastructure a little bit? Yeah. Yeah, need more resources. Okay, so Josh, you seem interested in answering that question.
Yeah, sure, because we published that in our JAMA Health Former article. We surveyed, actually it was even before that, we surveyed innovators to ask what would they think about the requirement, and to what extent already are you collecting evidence after your authorization? And the vast majority are already collecting evidence and would be enthusiastic about participating in an evidence collection program broadly after authorization in exchange for earlier coverage and payment, no question. So that would be widely appreciated and accepted and endorsed by the innovation ecosystem.
Any other thoughts?
Well, I'm in agreement. Of course, I'm all in on the notion that prices should be aligned with value, and you can't know about value without evidence. I think the tension is that the best way to collect evidence is to use the therapy. And so, there's this inherent tension between restricting access through the process of coverage with evidence development and the need to collect expansive and externally valid evidence that reflects the entire patient population. So if we can thread that needle, I think that would absolutely be a terrific strategy.
So this one's maybe more for Josh again, and that is you did a lot of analysis maybe from the medical technology perspective and particularly smaller innovator perspective of a lot of the different barriers that companies face when they're trying to get their product to market. And you yourself have tried to survive that gauntlet a number of times. Can you comment a little bit about the coverage, the C in CED, and how that's been implemented in the past and how you might like to see that done differently? Have the coverage constraints been too much or too little, or are they right sized? How do you think it works?
Okay, so we're talking outside of CED, just the general state of obtaining coverage upon authorization.
Well, actually, I was within CED. So within CED, of the decisions that have been made, let's say Peter and Sean get their dream, and that is that we start to use CED more expansively in other areas. There's the C part of the CED, and the C part in the past under CED, under coverage with evidence development, as it has been applied in the past, has some constraints with it. And as Tamara and I talked about at the beginning, that's fully within CMS's authority to do at any time under any national coverage decision. It's not just within CED. There's no special power that they have to constrain coverage under the CED paradigm. But as it has been applied under CED, there have been, the TAVR example is a great one where there's a lot of requirements for to get payment. So Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'll just say, and Tamara, you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but my sense is that companies that are able to navigate that and essentially support it, for the most part, are bigger companies now. So there aren't that many small companies that are doing this because of all the risks that we just talked about. If that is your only product, and that as a company you're gaining a lot of risk, and it isn't without some substantial cost and investment of infrastructure and support, and it's a big commit. So from the innovators community standpoint, it is not that widely utilized. It's mostly a big company program. And unfortunately, I fear that TSET is going to be very similar, the requirements, the prioritization is going to wind up being companies that have, billions of sales already, and it won't be something that's really going to be a stimulus for the small innovators.
Well, speaking of innovation, a question from the chat here starts out with, "Hi, Darius." So somebody that knows you apparently. You mentioned that CMS could improve incentives for innovation. Can you elaborate on that? And was that question planted?
It was not planted.
All right.
One of my, I don't know where that comes from, but I'm very appreciative of the excellent question. So in order for there to be proper incentives for innovation, it goes back to why we're all in on prices being aligned with value. That if we ultimately get, if therapies that succeed financially are the ones that produce value to patients, and vice versa, therapies that don't succeed financially are the ones that don't produce value to patients, that's when we know that we have aligned innovation incentives. And so that it does, it's, of course, CMS is not making economic determinations, and I'm not suggesting that, but there's an aspect of what CMS can do to promote, to allow for greater access when there's been demonstrated benefit to patients, which is an important component of value. So they're one player in this very complicated ecosystem that determines the value that accrues to different innovations.
Everybody's alluded a little bit to like the challenge of when does CED stop? And in the coverage guidance document, I think, Tamara, you've got a very specific statement saying, CMS does not believe that an NCD requires CED as a condition of coverage indefinitely. That if the evidence, supports a favorable coverage decision under CED, it should be time limited. We've struggled with the challenge of NCDs with CEDs that either have not had evidence generated, and so it sort of stayed there indefinitely. And we've had NCDs with CEDs where evidence has been generated, and probably the cycle of review is slower than anybody would want. But even when we implement an NCD, one of the challenges seems to be with CED, how does it be flexible enough even during the CED timeframe? Because particularly as we know with medical devices, iteration happens quickly. So I guess I'd like to ask the panel, and maybe Tamara even too, that struggle of how do you write an NCD with CED that can be flexible enough during the CED time period to allow for changes, and the challenge of that when you write an NCD, because it's generally difficult to change that during that period, with continuing to generate what we all believe will be appropriate evidence to make a A1A decision and really benefit patients.
Anybody want to try to take it from the panel? Or Tamara, would you like to try to, you're not on the panel. Oh, she's going to defer to the panel first. All right, so anybody in the panel want to try to take that? Peter, go for it.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. This will always be a challenge of when we have sufficient evidence to make judgments. So we hope through better evidence generation strategies, T said, and I hope others in the future will have more evidence and better evidence. And so I think, again, in part it's a resource issue that ideally more resources will create better evidence and allow better judgments, and ideally ending CEDs earlier because we know more. The other, and it's controversial, give companies more incentives to collect the evidence quickly. And one way to do it is through tying evidence to reimbursement. That is not going to solve the entire problem, but I think it will create strong incentives to create evidence and ideally have us make judgments earlier.
And I would love to hear Tamara's thought, but I'll just say, and this is a crazy idea, but if we could be super clear about what reasonable and necessary means for a particular technology, and we know exactly the threshold that we're shooting at, then I think this problem could be solved. Because just like with an FDA study, we know what safety thresholds are, we know what the efficacy thresholds are. The study is designed, or the timeline for achieving that evidence is achieved, check the box, we've done it. Now there's still other things to consider. That doesn't immediately generate an approval, of course. There's, quality, other systems that need to be assessed. However, that makes it a time-limited thing. Statistics work. So I think if that can be clear, then we can these will be wrapped up within some reasonable period of time. The evidence threshold will either be achieved or not. It'll be clear to everybody, and we can move forward rapidly.
Any other thoughts?
I'll just quickly say, I do think there's one kind of technical improvement here that, the way of thinking about evidence collection is always typically viewed as analogous to trial design. I think that's not a great model here. Economists are used to these kinds of problems where something is evolving over time and you're trying to measure its evolution. I think accounting for that adaptive technological environment can be done, but we have to be less rigid about what we accept as statistical approaches. The literature on this has given us strategies for that, and we should take advantage of them.
So I don't disagree with what everyone has said. I mean, one of the ways that we become more flexible is we try to write an NCD to the limit of the FDA, not the right term, label. So that's one way. But I really like Josh's idea, or do you go by Dr. Macauer? Sorry.
Josh. Prefer Josh.
I really like Josh's idea of how do you define reasonable and necessary. I have argued many, many times the way that we define reasonable and necessary is in every single NCD. And one of the goals of TSET is to get to what you were saying, which is what are the health outcomes? What's the end game here? Let's put that in that decision. We'll have that conversation beforehand. Let's put it in that decision. And if you reach these metrics, we still have to test it, then we need to remove CED. And then to your point, to Perry's point of ending CED, I'm a true believer in sunsetting it. And so you write a national coverage determination, you say, well, we're going to sunset this at whatever date we're going to sunset it. Well, then that could either lead you to, depending on what that is, to a non-coverage or something else. So not everything is easily implementable, but I don't know that any of our ideas are that much different. It's just how do we get there? And that's the biggest challenge with the statute.
Great. Thank you very much for weighing in. Question from the chat here, and this is for Peter. The user fee model seems to work for FDA, and industry groups have hesitated recommending this for CMS. Although, is that totally true? We've got a couple industry, we got representatives from it.
MDMA does not support a user fee for CMS.
MDMA does not support a user fee for CMS, says the CEO of MDMA. So that would be a clear, industry has beyond hesitated, has opposed recommending this for CMS. Why? Would this help address the resource need challenges?
Yeah, a lot of people have written about this over the years. The pros and cons of user fees, a lot of resources generated, concerns about industry capture and all the rest. So, I think the same issues hold in terms of CMS user fees. I mean, my own view, ideally, resources would come from elsewhere. But how realistic is that? Not clear. Was it politically feasible? That's a big question. So, I think we have to balance that.
Josh, do you have any thoughts? You're pretty familiar with the FDA user fee side of things.
It works really well for FDA. And I mean, what's clear is CAG in particular needs more resources. I mean, and they have to come from somewhere. So either within CMS there needs to be reallocation of resources, or Congress needs to support this. I think from my point of view, MedTech, the innovation ecosystem that the United States is the leaders in the world for providing health technology innovation. It is a strong industry that is improving people's lives, extending it. It needs to be protected. It needs to be a priority for the United States. And so it is worth spending money on. So we need to find that money somewhere, and we should make sure that these types of programs are supported and encouraged, and there needs to be more. So I know there's a lot of, as you mentioned, a lot of politics, and of course there's potential for conflict of interest and specifically around the CMS user fee idea. But what I do think is this needs more resource. And we are strangling it. One of the most important industries in the United States, and we need to do something about it. So by whatever means necessary.
And again, Mark with MDMA, we certainly support providing additional resources to the CAG group. I think what's interesting, because when you hear, remarks about TSET will kind of double the capacity for NCDs, about the historical average, that's true over the last handful of years. But if you actually go back to 2001, when CMS provides a report to Congress about how many NCDs they do a year, they were doing 15, 20, for a decade plus. And so I can't speak to it, maybe others from CMS can, but something it seems like happened where CAG had capacity to do 15 plus NCDs a year, and now they're down to 2. So I think part of this needs to be, okay, what happened during that time period? Were there bodies that were lost? Were there inefficiencies that were established? Because if they were doing 15 a year a decade ago, it sounds like that should be the base case. And we're certainly supportive of HR 1691. The version, one of the versions provides an additional $50 million in appropriation. So we know Tamara does extraordinary work and we want to give that capacity. But again, I think the other piece of this was looking at the user fee model. This is limited to such a small number of companies who would go through this process, and the amount of money, you're talking about a $2-3 million user fee per submission. And so I just don't think the math in that regard. So just some thoughts.
Thanks.
So I think these are all great points. I mean, what we know from the FDA, the PDUFA experience in the academic literature is that PDUFA led to accelerated timelines for approval. It didn't harm patients. Peter's right that if you get the money from somewhere else, that's great. But the question is, where the heck is it going to come from? And it's a cost and benefit. Prices will rise if you have user fees. That's how, there's an equilibrium in the market that will lead to that. But it may be worth it if it's also tied to specific targets of getting things done quickly. But I think that's an important piece of this as well, because you can't just, have a user fee without an endpoint that's supposed to be a benefit.
Although I think, and I'm not advocating for user fees, however, anything that reduces the timeline to approval and full coverage will actually reduce prices, because the real expense is that delay. These companies, to be able to maintain their staff, their manufacturing people, all their teams awaiting the magical moment where they can finally sell their products and have people use them, that is at the cost of 25 million plus a year, maybe even more, sometimes more. So it's
per company, you're not saying
no,
globally.
Per company, per year. Think of the burden, right? That needs to be recouped. It's being paid for by mostly private investors. That's increasing the pressure on the pricing and everything. So time is money. And so anything that's going to pull in time has the potential to save money.
And arguably, if the certainty were to increase, the barrier to market access were to drop, you could also have more competitors, which could also impact price, right? John
Dwyer, Global Alzheimer's Platform Foundation. But in my sordid past, I have been a serial entrepreneur, so these comments will reflect that background. Not only is time important to innovation and development of new technologies, it's really important to patients. I personally think PDUFA has demonstrated a remarkable resiliency to find balance. Would always argue for more patient input into the PDUFA process. I think they need to be at the table more vigorously. But whether it's a PDUFA model or something else, I think one of the universal outputs here, Tamara, is you need a lot more money. And you should get it. Because if CAG is going to do its job and not be constantly criticized for delay or stymieing innovation, or most importantly, not getting needed therapies or devices to patients, you've got to have the money to do your job. I personally believe that the key is certainty and brevity of regulatory process, and to harmonize the FDA and CMS processes. I think a PDUFA-like, call it whatever you want, effort where the stakeholders and users and patients are on the front end talking to the agency about how the processes work. And the funding is flowing consistent with those discussions that could be independently done by Congress. That's not how Congress works these days, but it could change. Would advance the CMS mission and and drug development, and frankly, be very much in the interest of patients. Right now, we are quickly coming, I fear, to a place where you can only see 1 or 2 per year, rather than a robust 10 or 12 events per year, which is the minimum I think we need.
How does the panel think about 510Ks? And for those who don't know what 510Ks are, they are a lower risk approval process for technologies that are not high risk. And I won't explain how it works, but generally speaking, technologies that apply for a 510K clearance from FDA require much less evidence gathering and pretty fast clearance timeframes. I think like a 60-day response period is what FDA is mandated by statute, but it may lengthen for other reasons. So how do you guys think 510K and the amount of evidence to support patients and providers in determining if a technology is of value to them and can meet reasonable and necessary? Let me clarify. So I think the question is, when you have certain kinds of technologies that come to market with maybe less evidence than others, is there a role for CED in those types of technologies, or are they capable of meeting reasonable and necessary with less evidence?
I mean, 510Ks which are the majority of the clearances, are fundamental and essential for our healthcare ecosystem. We're talking about everything from like new needles, to more sophisticated devices, but always built on the basis of a substantially equivalence to a previous existing technology that generally probably already has coverage, generally already fits a framework. It's a few, usually it's the de novos that have clinical evidence that are the ones that sort of break new and require new questions to be answered, and those do qualify for sort of a CED pathway or whatever. So, I mean, that would blow up many companies and innovation in general if we lost 510Ks. They're essential and foundationally important.
So no CED for 510Ks. Peter?
No, I didn't say that. I just don't think they're necessary. Okay. I mean, there's already substantial evidence, substantial history with those frameworks already. So it's not that they should be deprived of the opportunity, they just don't need them.
Right. Peter?
I would agree with that. But I would also make the point, going back to my talk, that if we had a better national evidence generation infrastructure, we could learn a lot more, meaning, connected databases, EHR claims, other data, interoperability, and so forth. We would have the capacity to learn more about lots of things, including 510Ks. So I think, that's a place we need to invest.
Great, thanks. All right, well, we are at time. The schedule for today is that we're going to take a 15-minute break. The purpose of this panel is to be kind of reactionary to what they heard. And each of them represent a different voice of stakeholder communities. 2 are from industry. Well, actually 3 are from industry, but 2 are from the manufacturer side of things. 1 is from the insurance side of things. And then we have a patient advocate representative here. And so I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves very briefly and your connection to our understanding of CED, how you got involved in it. So John, why don't you start first?
My name is John Dwyer. I'm president of the Global Alzheimer's Platform Foundation. We are an organization dedicated to improving the speed, the quality, and diversity and effectiveness of neurology clinical trials. I am a patient advocate for the Alzheimer's neurological disease community. My grandmother had Alzheimer's. 7 of her 12 children had Alzheimer's, or at least were diagnosed as cause of death. Because we're Irish Catholic, I have 75 first cousins, and they are showing a marked start to a similar trend. I'm in the middle of the group. So I will be remarking from that experience, and obviously very involved with Tamra and the community on the CED surrounding the monoclonal antibodies.
I'm Bob McDonough. I'm the Executive Director for Clinical Policy and Research for Aetna, which is a large managed care company, insurance company in the United States. I think our interest is, as a private payer, what can be the private payer's role in coverage with evidence development? Pretty much so far, this has really been focused on Medicare. There are some open issues in terms of how a private payer might be able to participate, what their benefit plans might allow them to do, what the plan sponsors which purchase the insurance would be interested in having private insurers do. And so there's a real opportunity, I think, if CED can be expanded into the private space.
I am Greg Daniel, Vice President of Global Public Policy at Eli Lilly and Company. I do have to say, these views are my own and not necessarily those of Eli Lilly and Company.
Well played.
And so you asked why, what's my connection to CED? A couple of things. And I think, first and foremost, you invited me because Eli Lilly currently has a FDA-approved product on the market, traditional approval for Alzheimer's disease, donanemab, also Kisunla, which is under CED currently. Prior to Lilly, I was at Edwards Life Sciences, which also has lots of experience with CED. And then prior to that, I spent a lot of time at the Brookings Institution and Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy, where I contemplated and wrote on CED as a policy perspective.
Great. Thanks, Perry.
Perry Bridger, Edwards Life Sciences. I'm a senior advisor in our public affairs group. In my 13 years at Edwards, I've led all of our Medicare national coverage determination work with CMS and all relevant stakeholders. And of course, we have a NCD, several NCDs, and a current NCD now in process on our transcatheter tricuspid replacement technology that's undergoing a TSET pilot and also part of parallel review. Previously did work here in Washington, D.C., but started my career in health policy at CMS in the coverage group starting in 1997. And so that was a fortuitous time because it was when the agency was implementing our first really public and transparent national coverage determination process and the start of the Medicare Coverage Advisory Committee. So I guess I've been blessed to be at somewhat of the beginning, I'll call it, of the new process, and great to be here, part of the discussion, and appreciate the invitation.
Great, thanks. And Greg and Perry and I both all share that we were or have been former employees of the same company. But most importantly, Greg and Perry have been trying to follow my style, both in haircut, but apparently not in shoes. So, oh, you have red? Yeah. We should have coordinated on that, Greg. All right. So with that, why don't we go ahead and just open up with, or there'll be this opportunity for people from the audience to ask questions both online and in the room. I will kick it off with just an open-ended question. Any thoughts on what you've heard today? What was the biggest takeaway so far? John, let's start with you, and you and I are going to share the mic.
CAG needs more money.
Even though we have had coverage with evidence development for 20 years, there is some advancement and it's still live and kicking.
I would say I think the experience with CED for implantable medical devices is very different than the experience with approved drugs.
Not necessarily something we've heard so far, but definitely a point of view. Yes.
I think we really are at the cusp of a transformational moment. But we're going to need the resources. We're going to need continued stakeholder engagement, more transparency in the process and throughout the process to really be able to accelerate. And I think we all acknowledge that, we absolutely have to, in order to maintain and innovate and improve an innovative ecosystem and really ultimately make sure that beneficiaries are getting good technologies with proven evidence.
Okay, so it sounds like the theme is we need more resources, better infrastructure. Peter's concept of better roads maybe seems to be hitting a theme, except that I think it sounds a little bit like Eli Lilly would think that maybe there should be different roads or different paths for different kinds of technologies. Greg, can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So, I think so I said, the prescription drugs are very different than medical devices. From a regulatory perspective, the evidentiary criteria for approval for drugs is substantial evidence, and that typically involves multiple randomized controlled trials, placebo-controlled trials. For devices at CDRH, the criteria is quite a bit different. Reasonable assurance of safety and efficacy. Often it's very difficult in the implantable medical device space to have placebo-controlled or sham-controlled, and blinding is also very difficult. So often when CDRH clears a medical device, it might be with different kinds of evidence than, say, on the drug side. The practice settings are very different. So again, for CED and traditionally implantable medical devices, those are done in surgical centers or sophisticated academic medical centers, and it's generally a one-time procedure. Whereas for prescription drugs, those are used, in all kinds of settings, depending on the drug and the therapy. It could be in primary care or in specialists. In the case of Alzheimer's disease, it's in a neurologist setting. Drugs are used, over longer periods of time, not necessarily a one-time surgical intervention. But I think for those reasons, conducting CED as it was thought of for medical devices, just as we look at the experience in Alzheimer's disease, it seems to have, resulted in effects that go outside of what the original intent of CED was. So for example, in Alzheimer's disease, we talked a little bit about the CED already, and Tamara mentioned it. It was, at the time that Aduhelm was approved, Aduhelm was the only product, the first product, monoclonal antibody for Alzheimer's disease. There were questions, and Tamara outlined, and the CAG group outlined, certain questions that needed to be answered. But right now we have, I don't even know if anybody's using Aduhelm. I'm not sure, where the experience is. But since then, we've had 2 FDA approvals, traditional approval for monoclonals. They are proven safe and effective on clinical endpoints, multiple randomized controlled pivotal trials, and we're still in CED. And Lilly, in fact, has published a paper that looks at all of the CED questions and provides answers to all of those. But we're still in CED. And so, unfortunately, if there is a patient or family experiencing Alzheimer's disease, in order for Medicare to cover their product, they have to agree to be in a study. And so right now it's a registry for traditional approval. But as the CED is written, it does require a randomized controlled trial if there is a monoclonal that is approved with accelerated approval. So I think that is providing an example of, and it's the only example where CED, a final CED has been applied to drugs, where a patient has to agree to get into a trial or a study in order to get access.
Okay, so in a second, let me get a little bit of pushback. Bob, from a commercial payer perspective, I think Greg just made the point, drugs and devices are different. Different data, different settings, et cetera. Would you agree with that? Do you think that there might need to be a different paradigm for the drug industry versus the device industry?
Well, we were talking about that during the break. What would have been the consequence if for drugs there was no CED pathway for Aduhelm? I think the answer probably would have been no from CMS. And so it did provide access, even though the access would have had to been in terms of a randomized controlled trial. I think the fact that the CED requirements for the other drugs with the clinical endpoints are registry, it should probably be easier. If you look at the Watchman as an example of a non-drug where they are also requiring enrollment in a registry, it's it's a fairly minimal requirement. We talk about enrollment in a study, but it's not quite the same as enrolling in a study that might have a placebo control or, a phase 2 study. It's a registry, which I guess the burdens would be mostly on the clinicians in terms of filling out the paperwork, but for the patient, it should be fairly easy to participate.
Okay, so maybe it's possible that both spaces, if there are certain conditions met. Perry, you were going to say something?
Yeah, quick comments. I think we all recognize the differences between drugs and devices, but also as we're thinking about national coverage determinations with CED within the device sector, there are very different elements as well if you're talking about an implantable versus a non-implantable, for example. And so CED development around devices in certain cases, let's say for implantables, which have other complexities around them, provider requirements, et cetera, are very different than other devices. And so that's a consideration to take into account as we're thinking about how to write appropriate NCDs, especially with CED. The second point I wanted to make, just echoing, I think a little bit of what Tamara said, was it will be very helpful to have more guidance around the sort of the criteria CMS will use in determining, what to take on as an NCD. And just to reinforce the fact that, most technologies that come into the market, if they've got coding and payment, are not the subject of national coverage decisions, local coverage decisions. They will flow through the system or be adjudicated on a case-by-case basis. And so there still will be a very small number of technologies that are going to be evaluated at the national or even the local level.
John, did you have any thoughts about some of what Greg said in terms of the burden on patients or access?
I do. So I start with a legal syllogism and then I go to the patient experience. The truth is time has marched on in a couple different ways. And one of them is the Supreme Court spoke in Bright Loper Bright. And the case puts a very big shadow over the whole CED, because in my humble legal opinion, I was once a decent lawyer, the whole CED structure is now vulnerable to constitutional challenge. So we have to be thinking about what does the world look like in the best interest of patients if somebody challenges it and the whole edifice is found without statutory authority. That's not, in my personal view, that will be a bad thing because it will take time to recover, but to force Congress, as Dr. Califf said in another setting last night, to do their job and actually put together a reasonably well-constructed, thoughtful, market, stakeholder, patient-driven structure that gives Tamara something that actually can meet the tsunami of technology that's come at us is a good outcome after you get through a lot of pain. Let's assume that the current state of affairs continues. Drugs are different than devices. It's clear that the device industry has found some reasonable accommodation for the way the regulation's working with their overall industry. It is not working based on the monoclonal antibody experience. And with affection for what the mission of CMS, when we first saw the monoclonal antibody decision, they might have said no. Might have been a really vigorous response to no. First therapy to be provided to the Alzheimer's community in 20 years. First disease-modifying therapy had been approved under a very specific, detailed statute called accelerated approval and gone into the market for people that have a very quick progressive disease. A no would have been really something. So we got something different than a no. The whole class got covered in the absence of understanding the evidence behind all the other therapies that had come through that process. The evidence behind the next two was much different, much more compelling. And there are anecdotal stories about the first one. We were in all of those studies. It really now comes down to how is it that the FDA has a statute that says accelerated approval can be used to approve a drug as safe and effective, and then CMS, for which, by the way, this is a perfect case. Tomer's right. This was a drug which was overwhelmingly going to be Medicare beneficiary driven. 65 and over was 90% of the patients that were going to be warranted under that drug. And we've basically now, I would tell you, I'm in board meetings where nobody's going through the accelerated approval because they don't want to have to go through another undefined randomized clinical trial. So patients are suffering from the delay, that uncertainty, and the capital markets are unhappy with the uncertainty and delay that this inconsistency creates. So what do we do about that? We have the ability to, if they go through traditional approval, we understand that dichotomy is really difficult. I mean, it's really hard on patients and practitioners and the industry. But now we have a dichotomy that says you get a traditional approval, you go through, if it's a monoclonal antibody, focusing on amyloid removal, consistent with amyloidosis for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And then you go into a registry, and then you can still get the drug. Now, the fact is, we are not covering many of the underrepresented populations with that structure. Because one of the underlying problems with the way CEDs operate historically is they go to the best and the brightest academic centers, and the registries are just now flowing to practicing physicians. But as we talk to the African-American community, the Latino community, and the underprivileged in general, and the rural communities, they don't get, why are you asking me all these questions, Doc? That didn't happen in your device industry. You guys are getting this stuff done generally, you can correct me, in those same great academic centers. And as a consequence, you have a not naive patient population and institutions doing that work. As we try to get out to millions of patients, this is just another rub on the process that perturbs our ability to be effective. So my view is we have other drugs coming in my disease and in other diseases that don't even remotely offer the ability to have statistically significant evidence generated. Think about gene therapy. You know, we are not going to get a robust, we will never do placebo trials in gene therapy because you can't even get the folks for the drug, much less do a big gene placebo-based community on the other side. Once we get enough evidence to get past the FDA, we should be getting coverage to label. One last thing. There was something about our monoclonal antibody class that caused a spasm at the FDA, at Medicare. And I'm not judging, I'm just noting the facts. Until then, every drug I could find had been covered to label in an NCD. Not devices, but FDA-approved drugs were covered to label until this class of drugs. That's why she needs more money if she's really going to continue to do it. CMS, Tamara. We need more money, but you also have to ask, the administrative precedent was overwhelming, plenty of black box warnings on those drugs, and we suddenly got a CED where we never had one before.
Great, thanks. All right, I've got a question from the chat. Is the problem that drugs and devices are different, or is the problem that the product with the least compelling evidence and or more considerable risk went first? And how might the process accommodate the impact of that latter option? Greg, you want to take a crack at that one?
Sure.
You don't want to bash the other.
No, it's a careful question. Here's what I'll say. Regardless of what was the first part of the question?
Well, is it really that there's a difference in drugs and devices?
Yeah, I think it's both. And I don't, I'm not going to comment on what the questions were at the time of Aduhelm. I think what the reality is today, what John was saying, we have 2 FDA-approved products on the market, proven safe and effective through traditional approval. For those products, I don't think the A1A answer is a no. It's a yes, and we've published a paper on why it's a yes, but yet we're still in CED. So I think that is a problem.
Any other thoughts, Bob? Do you have any perspective on the question again is it really a difference between drugs and devices, or in the case of maybe Aduhelm, is it just that it was a really bad example? And if we had better, like you've got 2 new drugs coming to the market with much better data, maybe we wouldn't have this problem there.
Yeah, I think it goes first the question about whether there should be CED. Then we're looking at the specifics about 2 different drugs that actually have clinical endpoints and whether the data are sufficient. I think it's a very specific question that's hard to generalize in terms of how it may impact other drugs that might have other types of endpoints. I can understand CMS's trepidation. I mean, Aduhelm wasn't going to be just another drug. I mean, this was focused on the Medicare population. The potential candidates and such would mean that this would have, presumably have a significant impact on Medicare. So I understand why it wasn't treated the same way. The whole question about whether we have enough data on the other drugs, I think is very specific, but wouldn't necessarily mean that we can't apply CED to other drugs. Maybe it might be applied inappropriately in specific cases, but it's in general, I think it offers an opportunity.
So part of another question that's in the chat here is about, it sounds a lot like a key criteria for whether or not CED is triggered is that there's just insufficient evidence. Either there's not enough of it, or the evidence is inconclusive, or there's not confidence in it, or maybe it's evidence that's not relevant to what is important to CMS. So is there some way that we could do a better job of using the stage of approval, the FDA process, and to better coordinate, kind of going to what Tamara was trying to articulate earlier on about the benefits of parallel review and also the challenges of parallel review? Is there a better way of doing that? I know, Perry, you and your company have been involved in a kind of mini TSET parallel review process. Maybe you can provide some thoughts on how that could be done.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the big benefits of, the programs are the continuation of how do you engage with CMS earlier and often in your evidence generation development plans. And I think the hope for parallel review was that, there were mechanisms that would allow for more of that, and then quicker approval should your technology go to CMS for an NCD. And so, from a company perspective, trying to consider much earlier on how I'm going to build an evidence generation plan that's going to satisfy if it's a big Medicare population and subpopulations within Medicare, so we feel confident that the evidence can lead to a reasonable and necessary determination is important. And I think that's one of the challenges, actually, even as TSET now, is piloted and moving forward, is that even 12 to 18 months engagement with CMS 12 to 18 months before may be too late, because for a regulatory purposes, you could be well into your clinical trial already or well into protocol development, et cetera. And so, it's incumbent on companies to learn more to be able to say, as we're developing our regulatory pathways and evidence generation plan, how can we think ahead if we believe that we have an advantage to going for a national coverage determination, or we will be the subject of a national coverage determination, or there's something already in the books that will prevent us from coming onto the market and being covered.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, for sure, earlier dialogue and predictability is good. One other thing that we haven't talked about is the real-world evidence that generally gets done by companies. So, for example, Lilly, we collect real-world evidence on all of our newly approved products. And in a case of Alzheimer's disease, we're already following patients over time in the US and in Europe, collecting important outcomes from real-world evidence. So we're doing that, but that the real world evidence that gets developed, and now I'm talking outside of Alzheimer's, but just generally by the industry and medical device companies also collect real world evidence, but that generally isn't used in what we're talking about today. And so I think of this, if we're in the space of developing principles or the frameworks and things like that, I think, and extreme makeover, like very extreme makeover, would be this concept of delinkage. And I've brought this up before, which is delinking a Medicare beneficiary's coverage, an individual Medicare beneficiary's coverage, delinking that from this question of continued evidence generation. And so that would look something like, instead of today with CED, where every single individual Medicare beneficiary, if they want coverage, they have to go into a study or registry when that product is under CED, regardless of, power and sample size and things like that. Very well designed observational and real world evidence studies go through what is the hypothesis? What is the power and sample size that you need in order to have a very well designed study? So with a concept of delinkage, you could have an FDA approved product on the market. All of the patients where, the patients and their physician decide that that's the right product for them, according to the label, could have access to that and they would get coverage. And then delinked from that, separate from that, is the company doing real world evidence studies that are well designed and well powered that could bring very useful information, not just to payers and CMS, but to providers and to patients and to clinical practice guideline developers, et cetera. But I think, so my point is all of that gets done today, but it's not used in these situations.
Camera from the coverage and analysis. I'm not going to comment on Alzheimer's. I feel like the agency has said what they're going to say about that. And I have read the Eli Lilly paper many times. But real world evidence, I think it's a really important point, and just wanted to remind everybody that we've committed to putting out a real world evidence protocol guidance document to get to the points that you're making so that people will understand how we're using it. It's a guidance document. It's not binding on anybody, but we hope to have that out to help with all of these things that we're talking about so that we can make those decisions with real world evidence. And the nice thing about real world evidence, the patient shouldn't know. Or not, no, that's not the right comment. Sorry. The patient shouldn't have any burden with that.
There's no timeline on when that guidance is going to come out, but it's been mentioned and it will happen at some point.
Hopefully soon.
Hopefully soon. It's hard to predict in the federal government how to get guidance documents out.
So I think that patients, all fields would benefit from looking at this in two stages. Can we push the distance between, whether it's parallel or sequential, but that the distance between the sequencing is very, very tight, because trials are expensive and prone to failure at a frightening rate. So understanding what will help Medicare make a decision and FDA making a decision contemporaneously so that the sponsor, the device manufacturer, is working against one script. It's really important. And I still don't see that dynamic being pursued at the level that the fields that we all work in would benefit from. And so I just encourage that. I think when we talk to Congress, we talk about it, and that goes back to a lot of things we've already talked about. The thing about real world evidence that we believe is really promising is there are natural inhibitors to getting quite the ubiquitous, although just in our defense, my company's defense, our last trial, we were 40% non-white Latino. So we do diverse trials. It can be done with great intentionality and planning. But real world evidence affords you a much more broader landscape to collect data and meet those rural, less well-served populations and find out whether the same circumstances, both physiologically and just access to that therapy, are being presented. So I'm for it. I just don't want it to be used as condition precedent to getting coverage.
Greg, I'm going to let you go but I'm going to direct a question to you. When you suggested, and I think maybe Perry did too, this idea of, hey, why don't we just talk to CMS better early, often? And that kind of sounds like you were almost kind of pulling the rug out from underneath breakthrough pathways or expedited approvals or accelerated pathways. It sounds like you're planning the mega of all data collection way early on in the process of product development at a stage when a lot of innovators are not sure how much money they want to put into this product. It may not make it. And part of the reason that expedited approval or accelerated pathway exists is because it's, hey, wow, this is a really promising technology that could be a drug or a device. And so let's let it get out in the market faster, maybe with different, not necessarily lower or less evidence, but just different kinds of evidence. And so it kind of sounds a little bit like, well, we've got this one idea, which is let's have breakthrough. But the reality is that you're not really going to have breakthrough because when you get to market, you're going to possibly get a CED. So maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, I think first what I wanted to say was I think it's great that CMS is coming out with Tamara, what you said about the guidance on real-world evidence. I think real-world evidence generally is underutilized. There's so much power behind that. And also the technology in collecting the data. Like it used to be like it's just either claims data or electronic medical records that were so difficult to use that even within one hospital, one department, EHR is not talking to the other. But today we've got so much more, hopefully, I think, so much more ability to more routinely collect valuable data and link it. A lot of work to do. We're making progress. And also, apps and cell phones and, patients that can participate in the data collection through their own mobile device opens up a wealth of opportunity to collect very valuable information. And so having guidance on like data quality and fitness for purpose would be very important. On your other question, I didn't quite understand it, but what I would say is that, FDA and, there are a lot of very good pathways, fast track, accelerated approval, breakthrough. All of these are very purposefully built and driven to get products that have promise and meaningful clinical improvement where there's substantial evidence to patients faster. And what we don't want is just a scenario where it's sort of like, for products where we need to get to patients faster, that once there is approval, that there are just roadblocks. And so hopefully with, I think, like I said, like company generated and this better uses of real world evidence and data that are already being done, can help facilitate answering those questions that aren't generally captured in clinical trials.
Barry?
Yeah, I think I get your question. I think it's always a tension because you want to get to market as quickly as you can, and so you're always thinking about what's my evidentiary pathway to do that. But at the same time, like let's wake up and smell reality here. We're in an environment where payers are going to be asking questions about the evidence in order to make sure that they're providing, technologies and services to their beneficiaries that bring benefit and value. And so we've got to balance the regulatory requirements to try to get to market as quickly as possible with a strong evidence base, but then also be thinking about the future to answer these questions and to make sure that we're bringing valuable technologies into the market. And, I agree with Greg. I'm not sure I agree about the delinkage idea, but I agree with you that says like most of us are thinking about an evidence generation enterprise in an environment of the ability to collect real world data in new and different and efficient ways. And we hope CMS continues to de-emphasize like a traditional clinical trial hierarchy of requiring RCTs or comparators, et cetera. And they've commented on that already, and I think in a positive direction. So it could be that we obviate CMS or other payers from actually saying we need to develop policies, even for technologies that are coming to market with a certain evidence base through a new pathway, because we're confident that they will generate that evidence that's relevant to us. And that would almost be a perfect world where there's no need for policies because evidence generation is continuing apace. But in the cases where we know, and Bob can comment on this, payers will scrutinize if we don't have the evidence at that point, then, patients will face access challenges and innovators will have difficulties being successful.
Bob?
Right, and I think you're right. I think different companies with different types of products and the characteristics and what their goals are may choose different approaches. And for some, where the goal is not merely to get the, cross that finish line with the FDA with the accelerated approval, but they're, very laser focused on generating the kind of evidence in an expeditious manner that's going to get the payer coverage. They may choose that more burdensome path of having to have a more complicated clinical study to answer all those other questions. But there are a lot of other companies that have a different strategy, and that strategy is simply to get the product on the market. Maybe they will, are anticipating maybe that their company might be brought up by a more sophisticated, larger company that has more sophistication in terms of doing the additional work to get the payer coverage. And so they may opt for a more streamlined approach. So it's going to really depend on the company, their strategy, and some may choose the more burdensome pathway, and some may just focus solely on getting that accelerated approval.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit, Bob, like that latter strategy is actually probably, and Josh, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the only strategy that's available to a lot of smaller companies.
Yeah.
And so really what we're talking about here is the responses from Edwards Lifesciences and Eli Lilly, or Lilly, I can't remember if it's been rebranded, relatively larger companies, and are kind of in a position of, okay, we'll deal with it. This is reality. You're going to have to, if you want to get Aetna's coverage, you got to prove to Bob that you got enough information.
Yeah.
And that's just the way it works. But for the type of innovators that I think Josh Mackauer represents, smaller companies, startups, barely able to scrape by, they've got a great idea. But, those are either, hopefully they'll get be bought by a bigger company like Lilly, or they'll die. And what is your thought? And from a payer's perspective, if you look at the let's say it, if your responsibility is the health of your covered, I don't know what you call your beneficiaries.
Yeah, we call them members.
Members. Okay, so I don't know if that is your mission, is to provide for the health of your members. But if it is, and the one way to achieve better health is to be able to have access to more of these new technologies out there, what's your thought on the best way to address that?
Well, I'm definitely in the camp of being able to try to design your trial to the extent that it's feasible to be able to address the issues that the payers have. Obviously, I'm coming from that standpoint. I mean, obviously, what the payers are interested in is interventions of proven clinical value. There's a limited amount of resources, and so this whole idea of evidence-based medicine is that you're going to focus your payer coverage on things that are, that we know are going to have a clinical benefit. And so, our goal is not necessarily innovation for its own sake. We're a private company, so we're not a research company per se. And so, we're going to be looking for reliable data that this is actually going to be a benefit to the member, as opposed to an approach that might be more of an investment firm or whatever that would be interested in just promoting innovation.
Sure.
Can I make a comment, Barry?
Yeah.
I think, Josh, through his research, through the team's research, raised the issue that reimbursement is often seen as like the first and primary barrier, especially for a smaller or early innovator. So, and one of the things is that we're all looking for certainty, which says, if we do generate a type of evidence, like, will there be certainty that, when we come onto the market, for example, that, payers will cover that, et cetera. And through some of the new programs at CMS, like, we're hoping that we're seeing more, that we hope we'll see more certainty. But part of that is also speed. And, I think part of the promise of TSET, part of the promise of some of these programs is that also there's, a speed in terms of, hey, this will move quickly and result in a decision, in a timely fashion. And so even within CMS's like statutory timelines for a national coverage determination with CED or through the TSET process in the CED framework, you can make a decision in less time than your statutory timelines. And if all stakeholders have done the work, the hope and the aspiration is that these decisions will be able to be made much more quickly.
I'm going to say, first of all, thank you to our panelists for making the trip for some of you down here and also for joining or out here from the West Coast. Thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate your help here.